What is up, Ivy Nation? Welcome to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I'm Vince D'Addario, that guy over there. That's Trevor Trowbridge, and we are here to talk a little bit more about this Notre Dame Georgia matchup in the Sugar Bowl that is going to be going down on January 1st, late at night. Frankly, 8:45 Eastern Time is the planned kickoff. And let's see, I'll be leaving for New Orleans here on about 3 days. So I'm pretty fired up about the entire situation. So should be a lot of fun. The plane ride home will be much better if Notre Dame can take care of their business down in New Orleans. Obviously we'll see what happens. But today we are going to break down the Notre Dame defense versus the Georgia offense. And there's a lot going on here, Trevor, and we're sitting here on December 27th. We've got about 5 days before this thing finally kicks off, and there's so much stuff to dig into. And we're gonna dig into this thing. We're gonna dig into the matchups, and we're gonna talk about all of the big question marks. You said it before the show, like I think this game is won or lost on the other side of the ball, Notre Dame's offense versus Georgia's defense. But I think that this side of the ball just has the most question marks about, Riley Mills is out. You've got all these starters out for Notre Dame throughout the course of the season. And then Georgia has a backup quarterback that out of the thousands of plays that they have run offensively this season, he's run 80 of them. And they've been against, it's mop-up duty, except for the SEC championship. So there's a lot going on here, Trevor. First of all, how you doing today? Hope everything is going well over in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, man, we're good. We're good. This is only second Vince and Trev show.
It's been a minute too, by the way. I mean, it's been a minute. Like our paths, they just don't cross that often. When it's just the two of us. So I'm kind of fired up about the entire thing. And for those of you that are worried about Brian, he's still gainfully employed by Irish Breakdown. He owns the place, so he's not going anywhere. But since I'm on Christmas break and Brian has some other stuff to take care of today, to tend to, if you will, he asked if I would jump in and do the show. So here I am, and I'm fired up about it because I get to hang with my man Trev. So yeah, this is gonna be a big time matchup. Even though we don't think it's necessarily going to dictate who wins or loses, it is still a very important matchup, in this game. Notre Dame's defense, who has been the strength of Notre Dame for a decade, against Georgia's offense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm excited. Game's five days out, and it's weird to think that. I mean, each growing day, the Indiana game gets farther and farther in the rear view mirror,
right?
And it's a big one. Brian and I spent a lot of time talking yesterday about how this game can come in and change a lot of narratives, and a lot of narratives around, can Notre Dame win that game? Can they get over that big hump? And the defense is going to play a big part of that. You guys know the old saying is defense wins championships. Some people believe that it's a little bit different. Brian has a different philosophy on it, and I tend to fall in suit with that. I mean, defense gets you there. Offense has to get you through the door.
Yeah.
Right. But this is, Vince, you already brought it up, it's a weird matchup because typically every game that we go in and prep for Notre Dame's defense, we kind of know what to expect, right? It's Notre Dame's defense. They're really good. Not a whole lot of question marks there. But now with the absence of Riley Mills and with the injuries that have mounted up for Notre Dame all season, going up against a Georgia team who's without Carson Beck, and Trevor Etienne is only playing in his second game back from his rib injury. And there's a lot of question marks of, hey, is Georgia's offensive line finally fully healthy? Because that's been a question mark for them throughout this season. So there's a lot of different narratives going on outside of just what's going to be happening on the field. So on one side of the ball, Notre Dame's offense versus Georgia's defense, I think that's the key to this game. But then you also look at this matchup and you kind of just don't know how it's going to go.
Right.
Notre Dame has played, 13 games this season? And every week I feel like I'm talking about the same thing of, is this the week? Is this the week that the injury bug finally catches up with Notre Dame and it's evident that they are without Riley Mills and a not 100% healthy Howard Cross potentially, and then, they're without Ben Morrison, and they're without Kingston, and they're without Boubacar Traore, and they're without Jordan Botello. And so is that going to be this game? I don't know, because Georgia's had their own injury bug that they've had to deal with. But, overall, I'm excited to dive into it with you today, man. I mean, it's slowly come up on that point for me where it's like, all right, we've done a lot of talking about this game.
You're right.
About as much film as I can watch. I'm ready to watch it go down, because all of the speculation and all the questions that we have are going to be answered on January 1st. Now,
true.
It's going to be a long day on January 1st. I have a love-hate relationship with night games.
I know.
Like it's tough. Like I think it's fitting that that's in the final slot of the quarterfinal games, Notre Dame versus Georgia, because I'd make the argument that that's the most anticipated matchup outside of the rematch between Oregon and Ohio State. But waiting until 8:45 at night.
I know.
I'm going to have to do something to keep myself busy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's going to be football on, obviously, so we'll be able to do that. But you're absolutely right. Waiting all day for a game, I hate it. It's one of the reasons that I love I love noon games. I'll be honest with you. For a myriad of reasons, I love noon games. We're not going to definitely get into all of that, but man, I hate night games. I hate them for so many reasons. But this is even worse than a regular night game. It's 8:45. Like you'll be lucky to see kickoff by 9:00. You'll be lucky because I assume they're going to start the broadcast at 8:45, and then they got to talk for a while. So you're going to get kickoff at like 9:00. I'm sure our friends over on the West Coast will be extremely happy that it's a 9:00 Eastern kickoff, because that's 6:00 their time. So I'm sure they'll be happy. But I guess it's probably 8:00 local time because they're Central Time Zone. But still, that is Notre Dame goes from being the absolute first game of the playoff to being the absolute last game of the semifinals. It's kind of it's just
yeah, man. I mean, hey, dude, bring your caffeine for that post game show.
Well, yeah, you're not kidding on that one. That's gonna be a challenge all by itself. But so let's kind of watching the film, Trevor, and I'm curious to get your take on this. Watching the film, I'm watching, Georgia's offense, and it is a fairly typical Georgia offense in that their offensive line is massive. I mean, these guys are just they're massive human beings. I mean, you see their offensive line just trot out on the field, you're like, oh wow. Like Notre Dame has big offensive linemen, but they're more athletic looking, so they don't carry as much weight. But then you see the wall that Georgia brings out. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, because it depends on what kind of offense you're running and, all of those different things. I mean, the Joe Moore Award winner was Army, right? And they move and they do all kinds of stuff. And so they're an athletic offensive line. Georgia is just massive. I mean, they are a massive offensive line, and Notre Dame's defensive line specifically, they're not huge. Gabriel Rubio is the biggest defensive lineman that they're going to throw out there. And he's just a touch over 300 pounds, to be honest. So, they're going to be throwing a bunch of 250, 275, 285 guys at this massive offensive line for Georgia. And I realize they've been battling some injuries up front as well, but it's like they just reload with massive dudes. Like they just have massive guys. What are your thoughts on that particular matchup? Not necessarily run game, pass game specifically, but just their hosses up front versus, Notre Dame's front.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this idea amongst the national media and especially some of our friends down south in the SEC belt that think that this is, Georgia's size is going to equal them just being able to push Notre Dame's, call it undersized line around, right? Or at least their front seven. And you brought it up, like there is some truth to that, right? Like Georgia's offensive line from left to right goes 6'7", 6'5", 6'3" at center, 6'6", 6'7", with all of them going over 300 pounds, right? Like that's
beef
offensive line, right? I mean, to put that into perspective, I think Notre Dame has 2 offensive linemen starting that are under 295, I think. And so, there is a little bit of truth to that, but here's how I look at it. Notre Dame rarely comes into matchups where their defensive line is bigger than the offensive line, right? And now with the injury to Riley Mills, there's some more question marks, right? Because like Riley Mills was the big guy, 6'5", 6'6", 300 plus, and the dude looks the part. Right. Like it's no mystery.
Off the line, all of those things.
Right. I mean, fast off the line, great hands. And I mean, he has moments where he's just forklifting centers and guards back into whatever running back or whatever quarterback is dropping back to pass, right? There will be times where it's going to be a little bit of a different look, and it will look different, and it will look a little bit undersized, because I could see some scenarios where, Donnie Heinisch and Howard Cross are on the field at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And those guys go 6'1", 6'2", respectively. Howard Cross is 288. Donovan Heinisch is 278, right? Per Notre Dame's depth chart and per their roster. So there will be moments where they look a little undersized. However, what Georgia kind of lacks, what they have in size, they lack in like overall athleticism up front,
Mm-hmm.
right? Their offensive line is big, but then you go through and you start breaking down what the rest of their team looks like. You look at their running backs. Trevor Etienne is 5'9", 205. Nate Frazier, he's 5'10", 210, but like they're built well, right? Like it's not like they're like 5'9" slot receivers running behind this offensive line, but they're not these big, formidable, like they're not 5'11", 225 Audric Estime looking guys. Then you go and break down their skill positions, right? Their wide receivers aren't like overly big. Arian Smith is 6 foot, 185. Dominic Lovett, their leader in receptions, is 5'10", 187. Dylan Bell is their biggest starting receiver at 6'1", 210. Right? Now, where they do make up in some size, they have good size at tight end, and they have really good size at offensive line. So I think that there's this preconceived notion that just Georgia's going to be too big for Notre Dame to handle. And I would agree with that if Notre Dame showed at all at any point this season that they're going to use their undersized line to just try to battle mano-y-mano, line up across and see who's stronger. That hasn't been Notre Dame's game all year. It's been their speed.
Right.
It's been their athleticism. It's been their bit like that. That was the progression of Donovan Heinisch. Early in the season, they were using him like a traditional 3 technique where they were trying to have him take on blocks from 320-pound guards. And that's not his game. Like his game is not to eat up blocks. His game is to use his athleticism and his quickness and his hands to penetrate the backfield early. And then the accumulation of all that, he had 3 sacks between Florida State and Virginia, right? So, yes, I think that there's this narrative that Notre Dame is small, and I guess they are smaller on paper than Georgia's offensive line, but I would make the argument that most, if not all, defensive lines outside of maybe Tennessee's is smaller than Georgia's offensive line across the board. So I think it's going to be a matchup of Georgia's size and strength versus Notre Dame's speed and athleticism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be which one takes the day, which I think makes this matchup all the more interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm with you 1,000%. And I think one of the things that Notre Dame does very, very well, with Al Golden at the helm, is some of those exotic pressures, bringing in linebackers, putting a linebacker at defensive end, bringing them off the edge, even a corner fire or, whatever. I think that's going to be key in this as well, just the chess match, right, between Notre Dame's defensive coordinator and Georgia's offensive coordinator, because while they are a bunch of road graders up front, Georgia's, there's no doubt about it. They're a bunch of road graders. What they don't deal well with is slants and bringing guys from different places and bringing guys from different levels and things like that. Teams that do not have great defenses have had success going up against Georgia's offense when they are the quicker team, from a front 7 standpoint, right? I'm not even talking about skill players on the outside. We'll get to that. I'm talking about with inside the box. You see defensive coordinators just kind of bringing lopsided pressures or, things of that nature. And then that allows them to get in the backfield. And, this is not a Georgia backfield of old. Okay. Etienne's a good running back. I'm not saying that he's not a good running back. He's a very good running back, right? He does a pretty good job of eluding some different things. And he's got a good one step, kind of change of direction, that kind of a deal. But when he gets into a situation where he's got to make more than one guy miss, he's in trouble. And Notre Dame has an opportunity. I'm not saying it's going to be like that every single time, but they're going to have an opportunity to make some plays in the backfield. And Georgia's going to have to prepare for the exotic pressures, the overload pressures, things of that nature, because that's what Al Golden's going to do. He's going to trigger, these guys, have them coming downhill. It's not just going to sit back in zone and let it be 4-on-5, 4 defensive linemen against 5 offensive linemen. That's just not who Notre Dame is anyway. It's not something that they're going to do specifically for Georgia. That's just who they are. And watching Georgia film, watching their offense, seeing what defenses do to them, Georgia's offense dominates when they can just do that. It's just one-on-one, not bringing a bunch of pressure, things like that. They do well. It's when pressure start coming. And then when pressure start coming from different areas, that's where Georgia tends to struggle a little bit. And I do want to put this out there because I know we do have some Georgia fans in the chat and some things like that, and we welcome that. We love it when opposing people come in. And I'm not saying that this is going to be a situation where Notre Dame is just dominating up front, against Georgia or anything like that. These are two of the best teams in college football. Okay. I'm not saying the two best, but two of the best in college football. And it's going to be a freaking battle, right? From first whistle to last, it's going to be a freaking battle. I'm saying, Notre Dame might have an edge here where Georgia might have an edge here. Like a Notre Dame edge, I think, is going to be some of those pressures, right? And it's not going to be every play, but, at times, I think that's where you're going to see Notre Dame have an advantage, is some of those exotic pressures. Now, the key here is, and we're not talking run or pass specifically yet, but the key is going to be taking advantage of those pressures. You can't, like we've seen Notre Dame's defenses in the past, get in the backfield, do some things, but then miss the tackle and allow, positive yards and things like that. You can't do that. You've got, especially against a team like Georgia, you're going to have to take advantage of those opportunities that you are provided by scheme. Okay. If you get in the backfield, you got to make a play, right? You've got to either bring down the running back for a loss. You've got to sack the quarterback. You've got to disrupt the throw. You've got to do something if you're going to get behind the line of scrimmage, because it's not going to happen on a consistent basis. At least I don't think it is. But when it does, you've got to take advantage. And I think Notre Dame can. I think they've shown this year that when they get back there, they take advantage. But that's going to be a huge key to this thing, is they've got to take advantage of those opportunities, because they're not going to be as, prevalent as like against Army or against Navy or, some teams like that. You're going to have to earn your spots, but you're also going to have to take advantage of those spots. Like that's the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. I mean, and you have to look at it on both sides of the coin, right? I mean, Notre Dame has struggled at times against bigger offensive lines, like significantly bigger, right? Like USC had a pretty big offensive line, and until later in the game, Notre Dame struggled to generate a pass rush. Now, albeit they were without Howard Cross in that game, and so USC could just double team Riley Mills every play, and Lincoln Riley drew up a great game plan and was just willing to cut his losses of like, hey, listen, like center, right guard, you're going to have to go up against one-on-one with Donovan Heinisch at times, and you're going to have to win that matchup. And it worked out well. I mean, I think Notre Dame's defense had one sack all game, and it was Gabe Rubio. So they weren't able to get after the quarterback that much in that game. So there's going to be it's a tall order for Notre Dame as well, right? But to put some numbers behind just the overall picture of this matchup here, right? You guys see it here. I mean, this is Notre Dame's defensive rankings versus Georgia's offensive rankings. And we've talked all season long about how Notre Dame's defense has been the strength of its team. And when we dive into the stats, you kind of see why. They're third in the country in points per game, number 8 in the country in yards per game, 5th in the country in yards per play, which I think is a little bit more indicative of how efficient this defense is outside of just looking at total yards per game. You look at their red zone defense, they're 9th in scoring percentage. They are 36 in touchdown percentage. But again, I'll have to go back and check and look. But I'm pretty sure, once again, Notre Dame's defense is dead last in the country in allowing teams to enter the red zone because they were going into the game. Yeah, as far as attempts go. So, I think going into the USC game, they were dead last in allowing teams to make it to the red zone. So there are things that Notre Dame's defense does well. It's hard to move the ball on them like we've seen all season long. And when they do reach the red zone, they're number 9 in the country in allowing teams and putting points on the board, right? They also do a really good job of turning the ball over, right? Turnovers gained. They have 29 on the season. That ranks number 1 in the country. I think they're tied first right now. And then you look at it on the Georgia side. I think that some of these numbers you have to look at with a little bit of context, right? Because, I mean, you guys all have heard it. I've heard it. Vince has heard it. But Georgia has played one of, if not the toughest schedule in college football this year, right? They played Texas twice. They played Tennessee. They played Ole Miss. They played Alabama. And they're still able to rattle off 33.2 points per game, albeit that ranks 29th in the country. However, when you add a little bit of context to that, Tennessee had the number 7 scoring defense in the country. They allowed 16.1 points per game. Georgia put up 31. Ole Miss had the number 4 scoring defense of the game or of the in college football, and they gave up 13.9 points. Now, those numbers held true against Georgia, and they held Georgia to 10 points and only 1 offensive touchdown. They played Texas twice, who has the number 2 scoring defense in the country, and they hold opponents to 13.7. 13.3 points per game. In the first game, they scored 30 points. In the second game, they scored 22, and it took them until overtime to do so. However, their backup quarterback came in, which we'll dive more into once we talk about Georgia's passing game. But the one thing that I do think that's interesting with Texas is in both games, all scores were either field goals or rushing touchdowns. So they didn't throw a single passing touchdown either time against Texas's pass defense, right? Which is one of the better ones in the country, similar to Notre Dame's. Then they played Alabama, and Alabama has the number 10 scoring defense in the country, and they put up 34 points in them, albeit it was a loss. But that second half rally that they had was impressive. They outscored, after the first quarter, Georgia outscored Alabama 34-20 in one of probably the crazier college football games of the year. Vince, I think we were actually doing a post-game show.
Of course,
when that game was going down. So, but it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah.
But when you dive into these stats, overall, Vince, what's kind of some of the first things that come to your mind when you see the team comparison overall?
Well, it's always interesting to start comparing stats and ranks and all of those different things. I see a lot of single-digit ranks on the left side, and I only see one on the right side. Like that's what stands out to me the most. Again, Georgia played one heck of a schedule. No one's going to deny that, right? And so some of these numbers might be a little inflated, but then again, some of Notre Dame's numbers are a little deflated because, as D. Trollhunter said, there was a lot of touchdowns that were given up, late in the game. And Notre Dame should have the number 1 points per game, number 1 scoring defense in the country if it wasn't for those, garbage time touchdowns and things like that. So, I think these numbers are important to look at, but they are not the be-all, end-all, I guess is the best way to put it. And then you look at the fact that, Georgia doesn't have the same quarterback that they accumulated all of these stats with. They've got somebody different. I'm not saying that's better or worse, but it is different, right? And Notre Dame has obviously sustained some injuries along the way as well. Look, the bottom line is Notre Dame has they have an elite defense. They have an elite defense. And Georgia's offense is very good, but they're not elite. Okay. So I'm not saying that, again, Notre Dame is going to dominate Georgia, but I am saying if you are going to get Georgia at any point, I like the fact that they're getting them this year. Okay. Because they're not as good. Look, they don't have the stable of running backs that they've had in the past, right? Some of those running backs that Georgia has put out are still doing amazing things in the NFL. Like we're talking serious running backs, right? They don't have that this year. They have good to solid running backs, no doubt about it, but they don't have the stable of running backs that they had in the past. I don't think their offensive line is as athletic as it's been in the past. They're big, they're huge, right? But I think they can be got at times, okay? Look, I think their tight end room is one of the best in the country. I don't think they don't have that Brock Bowers, that headliner, but they've got depth. The tight ends are going to be a challenge. Wide receivers, right? Good to very good wide receivers, but they're not guys that they're not like Alabama's receivers of old or, things like that. Like I wouldn't bet the farm on the wide receivers, right? That of Georgia that they're going to be able to take this game over. You know what I mean? Are they going to make plays? Yeah, I think they can make plays. But I'm not saying that I don't think they can take over against Notre Dame's secondary, right? So across the board, it's a very good offense, but it's not an elite offense. And so I think that there are places where Notre Dame can take advantage. I like Notre Dame's matchups in this game better than I would have in the past. I think that's what it is for me. Georgia is not who they were when they won the national championship. Could they still win? Absolutely. They're a solid, deep team. There's no doubt about it, right? Can they overcome the quarterback? Can they overcome some of the things that they've had go wrong with the offensive line? You know, is ETN going to be the running back that he was at the beginning of the season before his injury, right? I don't think we know the answer to that, to be perfectly honest with you. And so I like the matchups. I do. I like the matchups in this game from a Notre Dame standpoint. Again, it's going to be a dogfight, pardon the pun, but it's going to be a dogfight the entire game. But I do feel like Notre Dame is going to be able to make plays. When Notre Dame played Georgia the last two times in 17 and 19, it was like, okay, well, there's a lot of stuff that has to go right for Notre Dame to win this game. And they were in it. They had opportunities, and they couldn't do it. I feel like if Notre Dame is in the game and they have opportunities, they'll be able to overcome some of those opportunities in this game. So that's where I'm at when I look at these numbers and, you know, things like that. And you know, looking at Georgia's numbers and thinking about watching them on tape, I think it tracks, to be perfectly honest with you. I think it tracks. You know, they're not an overall like big play offense. They rank 28th in the country, but they're a grinded out type of offense. So Notre Dame's going to have to bring their lunch pail. You know what I mean? Like, they take 3 downs to get a first down, you know, that kind of stuff. They'll grind you out and wear you down and keep your offense on the sideline. That's what Notre Dame is going to have to do a good job of. They got to get the Georgia offense off the field.
Yeah, man, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, when you break this down and you start looking at situational football, right? That's a big key to this game.
Yep.
And one of the biggest ones is the turnover battle. And Georgia has not done a great job at protecting the football this year. 13 of their 18 turnovers have been interceptions.
And a lot of that's Carson Beck and his, you know, his propensities to throw interceptions. And I think that's why the Georgia fan base is like, oh, we're better with the backup. Like, we're better that Carson Beck is on the sideline. Now, I think that's a little bit of revisionist history because I do think Carson Beck is a good quarterback. And again, as I'm watching, like, for example, I was watching the Kentucky game, which is the 3rd game of the season. They kept talking over and over about how he's the leader for the Heisman Trophy and like all these different things. Like, I think they forget who they thought Carson Beck was, you know, at the beginning of the season. And then he got the yips. I mean, he was making some bad decisions. I'm not going to explain away, you know, his play, but to think that a kid's going to come off the bench and play better, is it possible? Sure. But I don't think it's a guarantee.
No, I agree. I mean, in his final 3 games of the season, he had something like he finished off the year with 11 touchdown passes and 1 interception in his final 3 games. So
there you go.
He started to turn it around a little bit. Right. But then you look at Notre Dame. They're the number 1 team in the country in forcing turnovers. Right. You start looking at 3rd down percentage. Notre Dame is a really good 3rd down defensive team. They rank number 7 in the country, while Georgia this year has had trouble sustaining drives. You know, they're 63rd in the country. They convert first downs at just a hair short of 41%. So when you look at some of these matchups from a statistical perspective, some of the things kind of lean in favor of Notre Dame. Right. You look at, you know, a best on best matchup is going to be the Notre Dame's red zone defense versus Georgia's red zone offense. Right. The scoring percentage for Notre Dame is top 10 in the country, and Georgia scores in the top 5% of the country at 93.1% of the time. They make it inside of the 20-yard line. They're coming away with some sort of points.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is can it be converted into touchdowns? Because I think this is a game where, with how grinded out it's going to be and how slow paced the game is, a field goal is kind of like, you know, I mean, the field goal kicking game is what lost Texas that game. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they went 3 red zone trips and came away with 0 touchdowns. So it's going to be interesting to see which team can convert red zone possessions into touchdowns. And when you look at it from a statistical matchup, you know, even if you want to take away the 5 garbage time touchdowns, I still consider them, like, I understand the perspective, but from where I'm coming from, they still happened, right? Like, you still get, so yes, was it the second team defense? It was, but some of those were like against Virginia. And I'm a believer that if Notre Dame has the depth that it does, then Notre Dame's second team defense should be able to hang in there with the Virginias and the Stanfords and the, you know what I mean? So you go through and you break it down, and Notre Dame does have a habit of giving up touchdowns in the red zone. They rank 36 in the country in red zone touchdowns, while Georgia does a pretty good job of converting some of their red zone trips into touchdowns. They rank 19th in the country. So, you look at these matchups and you look and see, okay, like, who's going to win the situational football game? Is Notre Dame going to be able to come away with turnovers? Are they going to be able to get their defense off the field on third down? Because on paper, Georgia doesn't do a good job of protecting the football and keeping their offense on the field. That's where they've struggled. That's why they went down 17-0 against Georgia Tech. That's why they went down 28-0 against Alabama. That's why they were down going into the fourth quarter against Kentucky. That's why they struggled early against Mississippi State. So, to me, overall, what these numbers show, very similar to what we talked about yesterday, Georgia as a team is it's very up and down, and the highs are really high and the lows can be low sometimes. But when they're humming, they're humming. So those are kind of my takeaways from these stats overall. Any final thoughts, Vince, on the overview of their stats?
I'm excited to kind of get into the weeds here a little bit with the run game and the pass game, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't want to jump into this too deep because I don't want to give away what we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I'm fired up, ready to get to the next spot. How about you?
No, I'm ready to go, man. Let's do it.
All right. Well, hey, before we get to it, everybody make sure you hit the like button, that subscribe button, that notification bell, share with your family and friends, and of course, jump on the boards at irishbreakdown.com, all kinds of good stuff over there. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that Brian is not on the show today, is he is putting together some content, not only for the board, but for the website. So you're going to want to get over there at boards.irishbreakdown.com.